The harsh, gritty texture of the sidewalk scraped against Sarah Johnson's thin jeans as she sank down beside the pile of black trash bags that now contained her entire life. A city bus hissed past, spewing a cloud of warm, acrid exhaust that mingled with the sour smell of a nearby dumpster. In the distance, a siren wailed, a lonely sound that seemed to mirror the scream trapped in her own throat. She felt a profound numbness, a disbelieving calm that was the only thing holding back a tidal wave of panic. Her heart was a heavy, muffled drum against her ribs. The landlord's final words, cold and sharp as splintered glass, still echoed in her ears, followed by the definitive, soul-shattering slam of the apartment door. Lucas, her 8-year-old son, sat silently on their one battered suitcase, his small hands clasped in his lap, his face a mask of quiet confusion. He didn't cry. That, somehow, made the ache in her chest feel even worse, a deep physical weight of failure pressing down on her. Her hand trembled as she pulled the worn, cracked leather wallet from her back pocket. The thing felt impossibly light. She fumbled with the clasp, her fingers numb and clumsy, and a faint metallic scent of old coins and cheap leather hit her nose. Inside, the fabric was frayed. She pulled out the bills. 120, 2 tens, 1 5, 5 singles, $50. She counted them again, then a third time, laying the creased paper flat on her knee. A desperate, foolish part of her brain hoped the number would change, that she had miscounted, that a forgotten bill would magically appear. But it was just $50. Her stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. It wasn't the dull ache of hunger, though she hadn't eaten since morning. This was a sharper, more nauseating feeling, the visceral dread of a person standing at the edge of a cliff. A wave of dizziness washed over her. $50. It was a death sentence printed on green paper. It was the price of a single night in a grimy motel, the cost of a few hot meals. It was nothing. It was an insult. She looked over at Luke. His small frame seemed swallowed by his father's old jacket, the cuffs frayed and dangling over his hands. He kicked his worn-out sneakers against the suitcase, a soft, rhythmic thudding that was the only sound between them. His breath made small, white puffs in the cooling evening air. He was trying so hard to be brave, to be the little man of the house, a role he'd tried to fill since the accident. A wave of love, so fierce and powerful it was painful, crashed over Sarah, followed by a suffocating tide of guilt. Her heart literally ached, a sharp, stabbing sensation behind her ribs. This was her fault. She had failed him. She, his mother, his sole protector, had brought him to this cold, dirty pavement with no roof for his head. Hot tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She could not break. Not now. Not in front of him. He looked up, his big brown eyes, so much like his dad's, filled with a trusting innocence that shattered her. "What now, Mum?" he whispered, his small voice breaking her heart. The memory of losing her job was a fresh wound. She could still hear the clinical, detached voice of her manager, the words restructuring and cutbacks echoing in the sterile, quiet office. She could almost smell the faint chemical scent of bleach and ammonia that clung to her clothes, her hair, her very skin after a full-time shift. For years, her hands had been red and raw, the skin cracked from scrubbing floors and polishing the lives of people who never even bothered to learn her last name. A bitter, hot resentment bubbled up from beneath the fear. She had traded her time, her health, her aching back, for a wage that was never quite enough. It was a slow-motion disaster she had been powerless to stop. The final paycheck, the futile search for new work, the polite rejections, the rent payments piling up one by one, like stones on her chest, until she could no longer breathe. They took everything, her exhaustion, her sweat, her dignity. And then they threw her and her son out onto the street. It was a brutal, merciless arithmetic. The sun began to dip below the skyline, painting the clouds in bruised shades of orange and deep purple. A sudden chill dropped over the city, a tangible shift in the air that made the fine hairs on Sarah's arms stand up. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like ghouls on the pavement. The sounds of the city changed, the daytime hum replaced by the urgent roar of evening traffic and the distant carefree laughter spilling from a warm-lit bar across the street. Sarah felt a profound sense of invisibility, as if she and Luke were ghosts, trapped on the edge of a world that was moving on without a second glance. The tiny, stubborn flame of hope she had been nursing in her heart began to sputter and die. In its place, a heavy cloak of despair settled over her, cold and suffocating. Her body felt like lead. Luke shivered, a tremor that ran through his whole body. She pulled him close, wrapping her arms around him. But the cold was deeper than the air. It was the absolute zero of true hopelessness. The lawyer's voice was a flat, dispassionate drone, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of the city street and the turmoil storming inside her. He spoke of wills and testaments, of legal jargon that flew past her ears like indecipherable insects. Sarah gripped the cold and greasy plastic of the receiver, her knuckles turning white. She pressed it hard against her ear, trying to block out the roar of traffic, the distant laughter, anything that might distract her from the impossible words. The name, Eleanor Blackwood, conjured a fleeting image, a frail, bird-like figure silhouetted against a dusty window, a woman who moved through her home like a ghost and rarely spoke above a whisper. Sarah had been a peripheral figure in that quiet life, the invisible woman who came to scrub away grime and dust. Why would this woman, whom she barely knew, remember her name, let alone include her in a will? A cynical, bitter laugh almost escaped her. It had to be a mistake, a cruel final joke. Her tired mind felt stretched thin, unable to process the absurdity. It had to be a prank. Then the lawyer said the words that sliced through her disbelief. "Mrs. Blackwood has bequeathed to you her sole property, a small farmstead with a barn in rural Pennsylvania." A farmstead, a barn. The words were alien, belonging to a different world, a different life. He continued, explaining that while the estate had no liquid assets, the property, the land itself, was now hers, free and clear. A roof, a place to go. A tiny, fragile seed of hope began to germinate in the barren soil of her heart. It felt foreign and dangerous. This feeling, she didn't dare let it grow. Are you sure?" she stammered, the words catching in her dry throat. "The will is quite explicit, Miss Johnson," the voice replied, with a hint of impatience. "A copy will be mailed to a forwarding address, should you provide one." A forwarding address. She was sitting on a sidewalk next to garbage bags. The irony was so bitter it made her want to gag. She felt a wave of dizziness, the world tilting slightly on its axis. The possibility was too immense, too terrifying to grasp. It was a lifeline. After hanging up, Sarah stood frozen, the receiver still dangling from her numb fingers, emitting a low, steady hum. The sounds of the city seemed to fade into a distant buzz. She looked down at Luke, who had stirred and was now watching her with wide, questioning eyes. His small, pale face, illuminated by the cold glow of a street lamp, was filled with a child's simple trust. In that moment, the lawyer's words echoed not as a possibility, but as a command. A roof for her son. That was the only thing that mattered. The $50 in her wallet, once a symbol of her complete and utter failure, now felt like the key to their salvation. It was just enough. It had to be enough. A surge of adrenaline, sharp and electric, coursed through her veins, chasing away the bone-deep weariness. For the first time in weeks, a path, however narrow and treacherous, appeared before her. She had a destination. The decision was made not in her head, but in the fierce, primal core of her mother's heart. They would go. They had to. The bus station was a cavern of echoing announcements and the smell of stale coffee, disinfectant and human desperation. Buying the 2 one-way tickets to a town she'd never heard of in rural Pennsylvania felt like a monumental act of faith. She slid the crumpled bills under the glass, her hand shaking slightly. The transaction used up almost every cent she had left. The crisp paper tickets felt warm and heavy in her palm, a tangible contract with an unknown future. Luke, clutching a small bag of chips she'd bought with the last of her change, seemed to sense the shift in her. The quiet anxiety in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of childish excitement, an adventure. To him, this was an adventure. Sarah's heart ached with the weight of his innocence. She managed a weak smile for him, a mask of confidence she prayed he wouldn't see through. As they found their seats on the waiting bus, the sticky vinyl cool against her skin, she felt a profound sense of severing ties, of leaving her old, broken life behind on that cold city pavement. The bus rumbled to life with a deep groan and a hiss of air brakes. pulling away from the curb and into the glittering, indifferent river of city lights. Sarah leaned her head against the cool, vibrating window, watching the familiar landscape of her failure recede into the darkness. Each mile they traveled felt like a physical weight being lifted from her shoulders. The relentless grey of concrete and steel slowly gave way to the darkened shapes of trees and the occasional lonely light of a distant house. The air inside the bus was thick with the scent of recycled air and the faint aroma of fast food from other passengers. Luke, worn out from the day's trauma and the late hour, quickly fell asleep, his head a warm, comforting weight on her lap. Sarah stroked his hair, her gaze fixed on the dark, rushing landscape outside. She allowed herself to dream. She pictured a small, rustic home, weathered but sturdy, a place where the air was clean and the silence was peaceful, a garden where she could grow their own food, safety, stability, a place to finally breathe. The journey was long and punishing, a marathon of monotonous hours marked only by the shifting light outside the window. Sarah drifted in and out of a shallow, restless sleep, her neck stiff and her back aching from the unforgiving seat. Each time she woke, the view was the same, an endless ribbon of asphalt stretching through a rolling sea of green. The sheer amount of open space was overwhelming, almost agoraphobic, to a woman who had spent her entire life walled in by concrete. At a grimy roadside stop in the hazy light of dawn, she used their last few coins to buy a bottle of water and a stale pastry, which she split with Luke. He ate his half ravenously, his small face still puffy with sleep. As they boarded the bus again, the sun was a fiery orange disk on the horizon, promising a new day. The hope inside her, so tentative at first, had now blossomed into a quiet, steady flame. They were getting closer. With every rotation of the wheels, she felt they were traveling not just across a state, but toward a new life, a redemption. Finally, in the late afternoon, the bus driver called out a name that sounded like a jumble of harsh consonants. "This is you," he grunted, jerking his thumb toward the door. They were the only ones to get off. The bus pulled away with a hydraulic sigh, leaving them in a cloud of diesel fumes, and a silence so profound it seemed to press in on her eardrums. They stood at a deserted crossroads where two cracked asphalt lanes intersected before turning to dirt. There was no station, no building, not even a bench, just tall yellowed grass swaying in a listless breeze and the oppressive humidity of the summer air. The air smelled thick and damp, a combination of wet earth, pollen, and the sweet, cloying scent of something decaying nearby. "Supposed to be down that way." The driver had pointed down a narrow, rutted dirt road that disappeared into a dense wall of trees. A tremor of unease, cold and sharp, went through Sarah. This was an isolation more complete than she could have ever imagined. It was a lonely, forgotten place. She grabbed the handle of the battered suitcase and took Luke's hand. His small hand felt clammy in hers. "Come on, sweetie." "Not far now," she said, her voice artificially bright. The suitcase wheel, designed for smooth city sidewalks, immediately jammed in the soft dirt, and she was forced to half-drag, half-carry it. Every few feet, it would catch on a rock or a root, the jarring motion vibrating up her arm. The sun beat down relentlessly, and sweat trickled down her temples and the back of her neck, her shirt clinging uncomfortably to her skin. The only sounds were the scraping of the suitcase, the buzzing of insects in the tall grass, and her own ragged breathing. Luke stumbled beside her, his face flushed red with exertion, but he didn't complain. The hope that had carried her all this way was beginning to feel fragile again, its edges fraying with every difficult step. The dirt road seemed to stretch on forever, a monotonous brown scar through an endless, indifferent green. Her heart pounded with a new kind of fear, not of hunger or homelessness, but of being utterly and completely alone. After what felt like an eternity of walking, the trees finally thinned, opening into a clearing, and there it was. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a terrifying second she thought she might be sick. It wasn't a farmstead. It wasn't a home. It was a corpse. The structure before them was the skeletal remains of a large barn, listing precariously to one side, as if a great hand had tried to push it over. It sagged in the middle, its spine broken. The roof was a disaster, a patchwork of missing shingles and gaping, black holes that stared up at the sky like the vacant eyes of a skull. The wooden walls were a diseased tapestry of rot and decay, some planks weathered to a silvery, splintered grey, others dark and damp with ugly patches of green moss and black mould. One of the large barn doors had been torn from its hinges and lay half buried in the overgrown weeds. This wasn't a fixer-upper. This was a ruin. The silence was broken by a low, mournful groan as the wind blew through the broken frame of the structure, a sound of deep and final agony. A wave of nausea rose in Sarah's throat. The fragile hope she had so carefully nurtured for hundreds of miles shattered into a million tiny, sharp pieces. This was the miracle. This was the roof for her son. It was a tomb. As they drew closer, a powerful, suffocating stench rolled out to meet them, a physical assault on the senses. It was the thick, gagging smell of decades of dampness, of rotting hay, of animal waste that had soaked into the very earth, all overlaid with the sharp, pungent odor of mildew. Her stomach clenched violently. This place wasn't just abandoned, it was diseased. She could hear the faint, dry skittering of unseen things moving within the shadowed interior. Rats, or worse. Luke, who had been silent, finally spoke, his voice a small, trembling whisper that she could barely hear. "Mom, is this it?" He tugged on her hand, his face a mask of confusion and burgeoning fear. She couldn't answer. She couldn't speak. She could only stare at the wreck before them, the monument to her own stupidity, her own desperate, foolish hope. This was a grave. The full weight of her situation crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. The despair she had felt on the city sidewalk seemed like a pale, distant memory compared to this. That had been a crisis of circumstance. This was a crisis of existence. She had spent her last dollar, dragged her child across the state, and abandoned the slim possibility of finding help in the city, all for this, for nothing, for a rotting pile of wood in the middle of nowhere. They were trapped. No money, no phone. The nearest sign of life was miles back down that dirt road. They had traded urban misery for a far more terrifying rural isolation. Here, their poverty was absolute. There were no shelters to find, no strangers to beg from, no soup kitchens to offer a warm meal. There was only the oppressive silence, the suffocating green, and this decaying structure that mocked her with its very existence. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It was a tear not of sadness, but of pure, undiluted rage at the cruelty of it all. She felt the last vestiges of her strength drain away, leaving her hollowed out, an empty shell. Her body felt impossibly heavy, her limbs made of lead. The will to fight, to keep going, had been extinguished. She sank to her knees in the tall, damp grass, the sharp stalks poking at her skin. The heavy suitcase dropped from her numb hand, landing with a dull thud in the dirt. She wasn't just at rock bottom anymore. She had fallen through it and was now in some new, deeper abyss she didn't know existed. Luke knelt beside her, wrapping his small arms around her neck. He didn't say anything. He just held on, his small body trembling. The warmth of him was the only real thing in this nightmare landscape. She buried her face in his shoulder, her body racked with silent, convulsive sobs. The hope had been a lie, a beautiful, cruel lie that had led her to the end of the world. She had failed him completely, utterly. They were stranded, forgotten, and left to rot. Just like the collapsing barn in front of them, the world was empty of miracles. The sun began its slow descent, and the light filtering through the trees turned a sickly, jaundiced yellow. Long, distorted shadows stretched from the barn, reaching out like grasping fingers to pull them into the darkness. The temperature began to drop, and a damp chill rose from the ground, seeping into Sarah's bones. The air, already thick with the smell of decay, now carried the earthy scent of the coming night. The buzzing of the daytime insects was slowly being replaced by the chirping of crickets, a lonely, monotonous sound that only amplified the profound sense of isolation. Sarah felt a primal fear begin to stir in the pit of her stomach. The darkness here would be absolute, a blackness unfiltered by city lights, a blackness that could hide anything. They were exposed, vulnerable, with no door to lock, no walls to protect them. She looked at the gaping black maw of the barn's entrance. It didn't look like shelter. It looked like a mouth, waiting to swallow them whole. This was not a new beginning. It was the end. She finally looked up, her eyes red and swollen, and scanned the horizon in every direction. There was nothing, just an endless, unbroken sea of trees under a vast, empty sky. No wisp of smoke from a neighboring chimney, no distant glint of a car window, no faint hum of civilization. The lawyer's words replayed in her mind, now twisted into a vicious taunt. A small farmstead, her sole property. Had Mrs. Blackwood known? Had this been her intention all along? A final, posthumous act of cruelty? Or was it a test? The thought was insane, but it flickered in her exhausted mind. Sarah felt a coldness spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the evening air. It was the chilling realization that no one was coming to help them. No one even knew they were here. They had simply vanished from the world, erased. She and her son had been deposited into this forgotten corner of the earth to be reclaimed by it, to quietly disappear. The hope was not just false, it was a carefully laid trap, and it had snapped shut around them with brutal finality. Pulling Luke closer, she wrapped her arms tightly around his small body, as if her embrace alone could shield him from the encroaching darkness and the terrifying reality of their situation. Her mind was a frantic, buzzing hive of panic. What could she do? Where could they go? The questions circled endlessly, with no answers. They couldn't go back. They had nothing to go back to and no way to get there. They couldn't stay here. The crumbling barn offered no real shelter from the elements, let alone any potential dangers that lurked in the wilderness. Every option was a dead end. For the first time in her life, Sarah Johnson felt the true, terrifying meaning of the word hopeless. It was a physical sensation, a crushing weight in her chest, a cold emptiness in her gut. As the last sliver of the sun disappeared below the tree line, plunging the clearing into a deep, foreboding twilight, she felt a profound certainty. They had merely traded one kind of death sentence for another, swapping the quick, chaotic end of the city for the slow, silent, and lonely end of the wild. The first few days bled into one another, a miserable, monotonous smear of grey. The initial sharp agony of despair had subsided into a dull, chronic ache in Sarah's bones. Survival became a grim, joyless routine. They found a rusted bucket to collect the murky rainwater that dripped incessantly from the largest hole in the roof, the rhythmic plink, 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 becoming the maddening soundtrack to their existence. The water smelled of rust and rotting leaves, but it was all they had. Hunger was a constant, gnawing companion, a hollow pain in their stomachs that sleep could no longer erase. Sarah felt her body weakening, a profound fatigue settling deep in her muscles. The vibrant, desperate hope that had propelled her across the state was now a bitter memory, a cruel joke she had played on herself. Her heart felt heavy and slow, each beat a laborious thud of resignation. All her energy was focused on the next simple, bleak task. Find more dry wood, check the bucket, try to ignore the hunger. This wasn't living, it was waiting. The barn itself was a living, breathing entity of decay. During the day, shafts of dusty sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating swirling universes of dust motes and tiny insects. But these moments of light only served to highlight the ruin. The air was permanently thick with the suffocating smell of mold, a scent so pervasive it seemed to cling to the back of her throat and coat her tongue. The ground was a packed, cold earth, perpetually damp in the corners where the rain seeped in. At night, the barn became a different creature altogether. The silence of the wilderness pressed in, vast and absolute, broken only by the mournful groaning of the wooden frame in the wind and the dry, furtive skittering of unseen things moving in the walls and in the rotting hay. Sarah would lie awake for hours. Luke curled beside her for warmth, her ears straining against the darkness, every snap of a twig outside making her heart leap into her throat with a jolt of pure, primal fear. Her emotional landscape was as barren and desolate as the one outside. The fiery rage she had felt upon arrival had cooled to a hard, cold knot of bitterness in her chest. She felt utterly disconnected, a ghost haunting the ruins of her own last hope. Looking at Luke was a constant source of profound, soul-crushing guilt. His face was thinner, his eyes larger and shadowed with a weariness no 8-year-old should ever know. He rarely spoke, as if he understood that words were useless here. He had retreated into a silent world of his own. She felt her love for him as a physical pain, a sharp twisting in her gut. She had led him here, to this rot, to this hunger. The weight of her failure was a physical presence, a heavy cloak she could not shrug off. Sometimes, a wave of such intense self-loathing would wash over her that she would have to turn away from him. Her throat tight and her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. Breaking down was a luxury she simply could not afford. On the fourth day, the gnawing hunger drove Sarah to a new level of desperate action. They had to make this place marginally habitable, if only to preserve what little strength they had left. "We need to clear a space, sweetie," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "A dry space. Away from the walls." She pointed to a corner that seemed less damp than the others, piled high with ancient, decomposing hay. The task felt monumental, but it was something to do, a way to fight back against the crushing inertia. Luke, listless and pale, nodded silently. He found a piece of a broken plank and began to slowly, methodically scrape away the top layer of rotting straw. The hay was damp and heavy, smelling powerfully of ammonia and decay. It fell apart in his hands, a mess of brown and black sludge. Sarah worked beside him, using her bare hands to pull away the foul-smelling debris, her mind blessedly blank, focused only on the repetitive motion. It was mindless, exhausting work, a small act of defiance against the ruin. Luke, lost in the monotonous rhythm of the task, stepped back to survey his small patch of cleared ground. As his worn sneaker came down, it didn't land with the dull thud of boot on packed earth. Instead, there was a deep, resonant boom, a hollow sound that was shockingly loud in the oppressive silence of the barn. It was a sound that didn't belong. He froze, his eyes widening. Sarah, a few feet away, stopped her work, her head snapping up. "What was that?" she asked, her voice sharp. Luke didn't answer. He simply lifted his foot and stomped it down again in the exact same spot. Boom! The sound was identical, a low-frequency vibration they felt in the soles of their feet. It was the sound of empty space, a sudden, sharp shiver, completely unrelated to the cold, traced its way down Sarah's spine. In a world where every inch of ground was solid, unforgiving reality, this hollow echo was an anomaly, a question mark drawn in the dust of their miserable existence. Her exhaustion and despair were momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of something she hadn't felt in days, curiosity. It was a sharp, electric feeling, a spark in the cold emptiness of her mind. She crawled over to where Luke stood, her knees protesting on the hard ground. He pointed a thin, dirt-streaked finger at a single-care-wide floorboard. It looked no different from the others, weathered and grey, its surface splintered and rough. "Here," he whispered, his voice filled with a child's awe. Sarah pressed down on the board with her hand. It gave slightly, infinitesimally, but it was enough. She knocked on it with her knuckles. The sound was a tight, solid tock. Then she knocked on the board next to it. Tock. Then she knocked on the one Luke had stomped on. A deep, hollow thump answered her. Her heart began to beat faster, a frantic, unsteady rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't an accident of nature. This was deliberate. Someone had built this. Someone had hidden something. Her fingers, raw and scraped from clearing the hay, explored the edges of the hollow-sounding board. She ran a nail along the seams, feeling for a difference. On one side, the gap between the planks was tight, filled with a century of impacted dirt and grime. But on the other side, her nail caught. She scraped away the dirt and found a clean, straight edge, a cut that was too perfect, too precise. It had been designed to be lifted. A wave of adrenaline washed through her, so potent it made her feel dizzy. She jammed her fingers into the crack and tried to pull. The board groaned in protest but didn't budge. It was sealed tight by time, dampness, and the heavy weight of its own secrets. Luke watched her, his breath held in anticipation. The silence in the barn felt different now. It was no longer empty. It was charged, humming with a hidden possibility that vibrated in the very air around them. Her mind raced. What could be under there? Why would anyone hide something in a forgotten, ruined barn? She needed leverage. Her gaze darted around the cavernous, shadowy space of the barn, searching. Her eyes landed on the chaotic mess of junk and debris piled in a far corner, a tangle of rusted metal and broken wood. She remembered seeing something there on their first day, something long and iron, a crowbar. The thought sent another jolt of electricity through her. The tool she needed was here. It felt like a sign, a piece of a puzzle falling into place. "Stay here," she commanded Luke, her voice low and urgent. She scrambled to her feet and half ran, half stumbled across the uneven ground to the pile of refuse. She tore at the junk with a frenzied energy, tossing aside broken buckets and splintered wood. The sharp, metallic smell of rust filled her nostrils, and then she saw it. A long, heavy iron bar, its tip flattened into a wedge, almost completely buried under a rotting horse blanket. It was a crowbar, pitted and coated in a thick layer of orange-brown rust. The tool was heavy in her hands, its cold, rough texture a grounding, solid reality. The weight of it felt good. It felt like power. It felt like a weapon against the helplessness that had consumed her. She carried it back to the spot, her steps purposeful. Luke scrambled back to give her room. Kneeling, she wedged the flattened tip of the crowbar into the thin seam she had discovered. She took a deep breath, the foul air of the barn filling her lungs, and put all of her weight onto the end of the bar. For a moment, nothing happened. The wood was stubborn, fused to its neighbors by decades of neglect. She repositioned the crowbar, getting a better angle, and pushed again, her muscles screaming in protest. A low, splintering groan answered her. The sound of wood fibers tearing, of a long-held secret resisting exposure. Her heart hammered in her chest. A fierce, wild determination seized her. She would not be denied, not now. This one thing she would open. With a final, desperate heave, she threw all her remaining strength into the effort. There was a loud, sharp crack that echoed through the barn like a gunshot, followed by the screech of protesting nails being ripped from their ancient home. The board, nearly a foot wide and several feet long, suddenly broke free, flipping up and over to land with a heavy thud on the dirt floor. Sarah fell back, breathing heavily, her arm trembling from the exertion. Dust, thick and chokingly dry, billowed up from the newly exposed opening, catching in the sunbeam and creating a swirling golden cloud. She coughed, waving the air in front of her face. Luke crept closer, his eyes as wide as saucers, peering into the hole she had created. The open loop of the hollow sound had been answered, but in its place was a new, far more compelling question. They hadn't just uncovered a space under the floor. They had uncovered a deliberate, hidden entrance to somewhere else. As the dust settled, they could see it clearly. The opening was not a simple hole leading to the dirt below. It was a perfectly square void, about 3 feet by 3 feet. And set into the darkness was another layer of wood, a heavy, dark plank that served as a lid. In the center of this lid was a large, circular ring made of blackened, rusted iron. It was a trap door. A cold dread mixed with the thrilling excitement in Sarah's stomach. Cellars were common in old farmhouses, but a hidden one, buried beneath the floor of a barn, felt different. It felt sinister. This was a place not meant to be found, a place for secrets. Her mind, starved for stimulation, began to spin wild theories. Was it a Prohibition-era hiding spot, a part of the Underground Railroad, or something far darker? The questions multiplied, each one more tantalizing than the last. She had to know. She felt an almost physical pull toward the iron ring, a magnetic compulsion to uncover the final answer. She leaned over the opening, her hair falling into her face. A blast of cold, stagnant air rose up to meet her, a ghostly exhalation from the earth. The smell was overpowering, completely different from the damp mold of the barn above. This was the scent of a sealed tomb. It was the smell of deep, cold stone, of profound dampness, and of a dryness that was so old it was paradoxically moist. It was the scent of forgotten time itself, of air that hadn't circulated or mingled with the outside world for generations. Underneath it all was another, fainter odor, a dry, almost sweet smell of old paper and leather. It was a scent that spoke of preservation, of things carefully stored and long untouched. The smell didn't just enter her nose. It seemed to coat the inside of her lungs, a physical taste of antiquity. A shiver of trepidation ran through her, but the pull of the unknown was stronger. Her hand reached for the cold iron ring. What could be down there? The question beat a frantic rhythm in her mind. Her rational side screamed at her. It could be filled with snakes and spiders or stagnant water. It could be a collapsed well, a death trap, The air could be bad, but another part of her, a part she hadn't heard from in a long time, was whispering a different story. It was the part of her that had clung to the lawyer's impossible promise, the part that had bought a bus ticket with her last $50. It was the voice of desperate hope, reawakened and now roaring. Food, perhaps canned goods, preserved for decades, or tools, or just something. Anything was better than the nothing she currently had. She looked at Luke. The fear in his eyes was mixed with an electrifying curiosity that mirrored her own. She had to do this. For him. For them. Whatever was in that darkness, it was a part of their story now. It was the inheritance Mrs. Blackwood had really left them. Taking a firm grip on the cold, rough iron ring with both hands, she pulled. The trapdoor was incredibly heavy, its waterlogged wood weighing a ton. She strained, her feet slipping on the loose dirt, her back screaming in protest. It lifted a few inches, then slammed back down with a deafening boom. "Help me, Luke," she grunted. He scrambled to her side, grabbing the edge of the wooden door with his small hands. "On 3, she gasped. 1, 2, 3. Together, they heaved, a combined effort of desperation and adrenaline. With a final agonized groan of ancient hinges, the heavy door swung upward and backward, crashing against the barn floor and revealing a square of perfect, impenetrable blackness. The cold, musty air rushed out in a great wave. Below was a crude wooden ladder, its rungs slick with something damp, descending into the void. She had no flashlight, no candle. The only light was the weak, grey illumination filtering down from the barn above. It was now or never. She squeezed Luke's shoulder. "You wait here, don't come near the edge. Do you understand me?" He nodded, his face pale in the gloom. Sarah swung her legs over the edge, her feet finding the top rung of the ladder. It felt slick and terribly fragile under her worn sneakers. She tested it with her weight. It held, creaking ominously. Taking a deep breath that tasted of earth and secrets, she began to descend, her knuckles white as she gripped the sides of the ladder. The darkness enveloped her almost immediately, the light from above shrinking to a small grey square. The air grew colder with each step, the smell of damp stone and dry paper intensifying. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs. 5 rungs, 6, 7. Then her foot touched something solid, a floor. It was made of stone, uneven but firm beneath her feet. She had arrived. The absolute silence of the small space was the first thing she noticed. It was a dead quiet, profound and heavy. As her eyes slowly, painfully adjusted to the near-total darkness, a shape began to resolve itself out of the gloom. The cellar was tiny, no bigger than a small bathroom, with rough-hewn stone walls that wept with a cold dampness she could feel on her skin. The air was thick and heavy, difficult to breathe, and there, directly in the center of the small subterranean room, sat an object. It was low and rectangular, a solid block of darkness against the slightly less dark shadows. It wasn't a piece of furniture or a pile of rocks. It was a chest, a metal box. A fresh wave of adrenaline shot through her, sharp and clean, cutting through the fear. Her breath hitched. This was it. This was the heart of the secret, the reason for the hollow floorboard, the hidden trapdoor, the descent into darkness. It was all for this box. 1,000 possibilities, each more incredible than the last, exploded in her mind. She took a tentative step forward, her sneakers making no sound on the stone floor. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against the surface of the box. The sensation was a shock of cold. It was metal, thick and unyielding, covered in a gritty, granular texture that she immediately identified as a deep layer of rust. The damp air of the cellar had been working on it for a very long time. It was about the size of a suitcase, old and utilitarian, sewn with a simple, curved lid. Her fingers traced its edges, feeling the thick, folded seams and the heavy-duty rivets. This box was not designed for decoration. It was built for security, for permanence. It was made to protect its contents from time, from moisture, and from prying eyes. It was a vault in miniature. A new, more immediate question presented itself, a practical problem that made her heart sink. How would she open it? Was it locked? Would she need a key that was likely lost to time? forever denying her the answer to this overwhelming mystery. Her searching fingers found the front of the box. There was no keyhole. Instead, she felt a thick, simple hasp and latch mechanism, the kind used on old tool chests. A thick bar of metal was designed to swivel down over a loop, where a padlock would have gone. But there was no padlock. Had it rusted away? Or had it never been locked in the first place? Her heart began to beat a frantic, hopeful rhythm. She grabbed the rusted latch. It was frozen solid, fused by corrosion. She pulled, but it wouldn't move. Panic began to prickle at the edges of her excitement. To come this far, to be this close, and to be defeated by a simple piece of rusted metal was an unbearable thought. She refused to accept it. Using the heel of her hand, she began to hammer at the latch, the dull, metallic thuds echoing strangely in the small stone chamber. She felt a slight shift. It was moving. With a surge of renewed hope, she gripped it again with both hands and pulled. The sound, when it came, was shockingly loud, a violent, grating shriek of metal-on-metal torture. It was the sound of rust giving way, of a seal being broken for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The latch resisted, fighting her every inch of the way, but she was relentless, fueled by a desperation that was stronger than any corrosion. With a final agonizing groan, the metal bar pulled free from its loop. It was done. The box was unlatched. For a moment, she just knelt there in the dark, her chest heaving, her hands aching, listening to the echoes of the sound die away into the profound silence. This was the final threshold. The answer was inches away, concealed only by a sheet of rusted steel. She placed her hands on the lid. It was cold and heavy. Taking a breath that did nothing to calm the wild fluttering in her chest, she lifted it. The hinges, surprisingly, moved with a low, whispery groan. The lid opened. The weak light from the trapdoor above sliced into the newly opened box. And for a second, Sarah's mind refused to process what she was seeing. The light didn't just illuminate the contents. It was captured and thrown back, exploding into a dozen points of brilliant, fiery glitter. Her breath caught in her throat. A gasp, small and involuntary, escaped her lips. Resting on a bed of what looked like dark, faded fabric were several small pouches made of what appeared to be black velvet. Their drawstrings pulled tight, but from one of them, which had fallen on its side, a small stream of objects had spilled out. They were stones, dull, greasy-looking stones of varying sizes, but as they caught the light, they flashed with an internal fire, a prism of colors that was utterly mesmerizing. Raw, she thought, her mind numb with shock. They were raw diamonds. It was a sight so impossible, so far beyond the realm of her reality, that she felt a wave of vertigo, as if the stone floor beneath her was tilting. Her hand trembled as she reached into the box. She ignored the glittering stones and picked up one of the other pouches. It was surprisingly heavy, and it made a soft, dense, clinking sound as she lifted it. Her fingers, clumsy with shock and anticipation, fumbled with the drawstring. She loosened it and tilted the pouch over her other palm. A stream of heavy yellow discs spilled out, landing in her hand with a satisfying, muffled weight. Gold coins. They were old and worn, the inscriptions in a language she didn't recognize, but the color was unmistakable. It was the deep, soft, buttery gleam of pure gold. She let them run through her fingers, the metal cool and impossibly heavy against her skin. The sheer absurd reality of it was too much to comprehend. Diamonds and gold, a pirate's treasure, a fairy tale fortune, hidden beneath the floor of a ruined barn. She felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat. This couldn't be real. It was a hallucination brought on by hunger and despair, but it felt real. The weight of the coins in her hand was real. The cold fire of the diamonds was real. Her mind, reeling from the shock, slowly began to function again. This treasure explained everything. The secrecy, the hidden cellar. This was a life-changing, world-altering fortune. But as she stared into the box, she saw that there was more. Beneath the pouches of jewels and gold lay two other items. One was a stack of papers, yellowed and brittle with age, tied together with a pale blue ribbon that had faded almost to white. The other was a book. It was thick and bound in dark, cracked leather, its cover bare of any title or marking. A journal. A sudden chill went through her, colder than the cellar air. The gold and diamonds were a fortune, a simple, straightforward miracle. But the papers and the journal felt different. They felt heavier. They were the story. They were the why. A new and more profound mystery opened up before her, eclipsing even the shock of the treasure. She gently lifted the leather-bound journal from the box. It felt strangely warm in her cold hands, the worn leather soft as skin. It smelled of dust and time and dry paper. The pages were edged in gold leaf, now faded and flaking. This was an object of quality, of wealth. This was not the diary of a simple farmer. She ran her thumb over the cover, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. The treasure was the answer to her poverty, a solution to every practical problem she had. But this journal, and the stack of documents beside it, felt like the answer to a much deeper question. Whose secret was this? Why was it hidden here? And why was it left for her, a housekeeper, a stranger, to find? The guilt-ridden face of Mrs. Blackwood, a woman of quiet, deep-seated sorrow, flashed in her mind. This was her secret. This was her story. And Sarah had a sudden, terrifying premonition that the treasure was not a gift, but a burden. The true inheritance wasn't the gold. It was the story held within these pages. Back in the corner of the barn, with the setting sun casting long, orange fingers through the holes in the roof, Sarah finally pulled the leather-bound journal from the box. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of night-damp earth. The book felt heavy, profound, in her trembling hands. The leather was cracked and dry, but the pages inside were miraculously preserved. She opened it to the first page. A fine, spidery script, elegant and yet somehow frantic, filled the paper. The ink was a faded sepia. The first line made her heart stop. "May God forgive me, for I have been a coward." It was signed at the bottom of the page, Eleanor Blackwood. Sarah felt a deep, cold shiver run through her, a sense of trespassing on a soul's final, desperate confession. The faint smell of old paper and dried ink filled her senses, the scent of a story that had been suffocating in the dark for decades. She looked over at Luke, asleep on a pile of hay, and a new kind of fear, sharp and intellectual, began to replace the raw terror of poverty. She turned the pages carefully, their brittle edges threatening to crumble under her dirt-stained fingers. Eleanor's words painted a picture, not of a quiet, reclusive life, but of a gilded cage built upon a foundation of horror. Her father, the journal explained, was a man of immense ambition and zero compassion, a coal baron who had carved a fiefdom out of the Pennsylvania hills in the early 20th century. The narrative was thick with sensory details of that bygone era, the constant smell of coal dust that coated every surface, the deafening roar of the machinery, the sight of men with hollow eyes and blackened faces filing out of the mines. Eleanor wrote of her shame, of the fine dresses and lavish meals she enjoyed while knowing, with a child's sickening certainty, that it was all paid for by the suffering of others. A profound nausea rose in Sarah's throat. She looked at the velvet pouches beside her. The diamonds didn't glitter anymore. The gold felt cold and heavy. It wasn't treasure. It was a weight. The journal became darker, more frantic. Eleanor described a period of unrest. The miners, many of them poor farmers who worked for the baron to save their own land, tried to unionize. They protested the unsafe conditions and the exploitative wages. Eleanor's father, a man she called a tyrant in a three-piece suit, was furious. Sarah's blood ran cold as she read the next entry. Eleanor, then a young girl, had overheard a conversation late at night. Her father, speaking in a low, vicious tone to his foreman, had talked about making problems disappear. He spoke of accidents in the mines, of men who would simply walk away from their families, of land that would become available. A knot of ice formed in Sarah's stomach. She could almost hear the man's cold voice, feel the chilling finality in his words. The book was no longer just a confession. It felt like an eyewitness account to a series of murders, a testimony that had been buried alive in this cellar for half a century. The silence of the barn seemed to press in, heavy with the ghosts of these men. The guilt that had haunted Mrs. Blackwood became a palpable presence in the room. In her later entries, she wrote of how the fortune, the blood money, as she called it, had been a poison in her life. After her father's death, she was left with immense wealth and a soul-crushing secret. She confessed she could never bring herself to spend it. Seeing the faces of the ghost-like miners in every coin, feeling the weight of their stolen lives in every diamond, she became a recluse, trapped in her family home by the very fortune that was supposed to give her freedom. Leaving the barn to Sarah, she explained in one of the final shaky entries, was not an act of charity. It was a desperate, final prayer, a penance. She didn't know if Sarah would find the cellar, but she hoped that if she did, she would be a person with the courage that Eleanor herself had always lacked. Sarah felt a strange, sorrowful connection to the dead woman. She hadn't been given a gift. She had been given a responsibility, a terrible, heavy burden of truth. Her hands shaking, Sarah set the journal aside and reached for the stack of yellow documents tied with the faded ribbon. The paper was so brittle it felt like it might turn to dust in her hands. She carefully untied the ribbon, its fragile silk crumbling slightly. She unrolled the top document. It was a deed, written in formal, archaic language, with an official-looking seal at the bottom. But something was wrong. The ink of the signatures was slightly darker than the rest of the text, the lines just a fraction too smooth. She then looked at the seal. It was subtly imperfect, lacking the crisp detail of a real government stamp. It was a forgery, a very, very good forgery, but a fake nonetheless. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She unrolled the next document and the next. There were nearly a dozen of them, each a deed to a small plot of land, each bearing a different name. These were the falsified deeds, the proof, the cold, methodical paperwork of the crime itself. She went back to the journal, her fingers flying through the pages until she found what she was looking for, a list of names. The miners who had led the union protest. The men who had been disappeared. She held the journal in one hand and a forged deed in the other and compared the names. Miller, Kowalski, O'Connell. They matched. A cold, sickening dread washed over her, chilling her to the bone. This box didn't just contain a confession, it contained the entire anatomy of a crime. The journal was the motive and the testimony. The deeds were the weapon. The gold and diamonds were the spoils. It was a complete, self-contained story of greed, murder, and injustice, sealed in a metal box and buried for generations. The sheer, calculated evil of it made her feel physically ill. This wasn't just a historical wrong. The papers in her hands felt alive with danger, like a loaded gun, and she was the one holding it. The discovery no longer felt like a miracle. It felt like a death sentence. A sudden sound ripped through the quiet evening, so alien and unexpected that Sarah jumped, dropping one of the deeds. It was the low, powerful rumble of a car engine, growing steadily louder. It wasn't the sound of a sputtering farm truck. It was the smooth, confident purr of a luxury vehicle. Her heart leaped into her throat. Who would be coming here, to this ruin, at this hour? Panic seized her. She frantically began to shove the journal, the documents, and the pouches of gold and diamonds back into the metal box. Her hands were clumsy, shaking uncontrollably. The car was getting closer, its headlights cutting a swathe through the dusky woods, sweeping across the clearing. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She slammed the lid of the box shut, just as the vehicle pulled to a stop a few yards from the barn's gaping entrance. The engine cut out, plunging the world back into a ringing, terrifying silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a car door opened and closed with a solid, expensive thud. A figure emerged from the deepening twilight, silhouetted against the car's dying headlights. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that looked absurdly out of place in the wilderness. He moved with an air of absolute confidence and ownership, his polished leather shoes crunching on the gravelly dirt, as if he were offended by its very existence. As he stepped into the faint light spilling from the barn, Sarah could see his face. It was handsome in a severe, predatory way, with a strong jaw and cold, intelligent eyes that swept over the decaying barn with an expression of undisguised contempt. He paused, his gaze landing on Sarah, who was frozen in the shadows, her heart pounding like a drum. He looked at her not as a person, but as an insect, an insignificant pest infesting his territory. A cold wave of dread washed over her. She knew, with a certainty that had no logical basis, that this was not a friend. This was a wolf who had come to inspect a trap. The man walked forward, stopping just at the edge of the barn. He didn't seem to care about the mud or the smell of decay. "Sarah Johnson?" he asked. His voice was smooth, educated, and dripping with condescension. It was the kind of voice that was used to giving orders and being obeyed without question. Sarah couldn't find her own voice to reply. She could only nod, her throat tight with fear. She instinctively moved to place herself between the man and her sleeping son. "I'm Arthur Vance," he said, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his cold, assessing eyes. "Eleanor Blackwood was my aunt." The name hit her like a physical blow. Vance, the nephew, the lawyer from Philadelphia, the man who had been cheated out of his inheritance. He knew. He must have known about the fortune. He just didn't know where it was. And now he was here, standing 10 feet away from it, his predatory gaze sweeping over the pathetic scene of her and her son living in the filth. A tremor of pure terror ran down her spine. "My condolences on your loss," he continued, the words a hollow mockery. "My aunt was eccentric in her later years, prone to grand, sentimental gestures that didn't always make practical sense." His eyes scanned the rotting walls, the holes in the roof, and then landed back on Sarah, a flicker of something cruel in their depths. Clearly, he let the insult hang in the air, a testament to her foolishness for even coming here. Sarah felt a flush of shame and anger, but the fear was stronger, a cold hand squeezing her heart. He was playing with her, a cat with a cornered mouse. He was assessing her, gauging her intelligence, her desperation. Every instinct she had was screaming that this man was dangerous, that the smooth veneer of civilization was paper-thin, covering something ruthless and violent. The smell of his expensive cologne, a clean, sharp scent, cut through the mustiness of the barn, an invasive smell of power and money. He took a step closer, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the dirt floor. "Look, Mr. Johnson, let's be frank. This place is a worthless ruin. It's a liability, not an asset. The taxes alone will be a burden you can't possibly afford." He paused, letting the truth of his words sink in. He was right. She knew he was right. "I'm prepared, as a gesture of goodwill, to honor my aunt's peculiar wishes, to take it off your hands. I'll give you $5,000, cash, more than enough for you and your boy to get a fresh start somewhere else, somewhere clean." The offer was an insult. After seeing the treasure, $5,000 was a joke. A crumb from a king's table. But a week ago it would have been a miracle. He was testing her. He was watching her reaction, looking for any sign, any flicker in her eyes that might betray her knowledge. She felt her face become a rigid mask, desperately trying to project only weary desperation, not the explosive secret she was hiding. Sarah found her voice, though it came out as a weak, trembling whisper. I need to think about it." Arthur Vance's smile tightened, the warmth vanishing completely, leaving only cold, hard menace. "There's nothing to think about," he said, his voice dropping, losing its polite facade and taking on a sharp, dangerous edge. "This is a very generous, one-time offer." He let his gaze drift pointedly over to where Luke was sleeping, a small, vulnerable lump under a thin blanket. "This is a very isolated place, Ms. Johnson. It's a long way from anywhere. No phone service out here. No close neighbors. Things can happen." He leaned in slightly, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur that made the hair on her arm stand up. "Fires. Accidents. It would be a tragedy if anything happened to a child in a place this remote. A real tragedy." The threat was unmistakable, wrapped in a thin layer of plausible deniability, but as clear as a knife to her throat. He straightened up, his pleasant mask slipping back into place, but his eyes remained as cold as a winter sky. "You have 24 hours to accept my offer. I'll have someone come by tomorrow afternoon with the paperwork and the cash." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned his back on her, the dismissal as absolute as a slap in the face, and walked back to his car with the same arrogant stride. Sarah stood frozen, her entire body shaking, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She watched as he got into the car, the interior light flashing on for a moment, revealing a pristine sack, luxurious world that was light years from her own. The engine roared back to life, the sound an angry violation of the night's peace. The headlights swung around, momentarily blinding her, and then the car sped away, its red taillights disappearing down the dark, rutted road, leaving behind a profound and ringing silence. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the ground, her hand protectively on the cold metal box. The immediate danger was gone, but a far greater one had just begun. The silence Arthur Vance left behind was more terrifying than his presence. It was a silence filled with his words, his threat, his cold, merciless eyes. The box beneath her hand no longer felt like a potential salvation. It felt like a magnet, a beacon that was drawing a monster toward her and her son. The fortune was real, but so was the evil that came with it. Arthur Vance knew. He didn't know what it was, or where it was, but his instincts, the instincts of a predator, had told him it was here, and he would not stop until he had it. Sarah's mind reeled. The choice before her was stark and impossible. She held a king's ransom in one hand and the evidence of a historic crime in the other. Using one meant exposing the other. Running seemed impossible. He would find her. He was a lawyer, a man with resources and power. Fighting seemed like suicide. She was a penniless, friendless woman with a child to protect. She was trapped. The knowledge that had felt so powerful just an hour ago now felt like the steel jaws of a trap closing around her. The weight of Mrs. Blackwood's penance had fallen squarely on her shoulders, and it was a crushing weight. The treasure could give her and Luke a new life, a life free from poverty and fear. But it was blood money, and a powerful, ruthless man was coming for it. The documents could bring justice for men who had been dead for 50 years, but using them would mean declaring war on Arthur Vance, a war she could not possibly win. It would put a target on her back, and worse, on her sons. The money, or the truth. Her son's safety or a long-dead justice. As she sat there in the dark, clutching the cold metal box, the silence of the ruined barn seemed to ask a question. What would you do in her place? Would you take the fortune, a fortune born of sin, and run, praying you're never found? Or would you risk everything you have, including the life of your own child, to unearth a truth that the world has long since forgotten? The silence that descended after Arthur Vance's car disappeared was a physical entity, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered all other sound. The rhythmic chirping of the crickets, once a neutral sound of the night, now seemed to mock her. Each chirp a tiny clock ticking down the 24 hours she didn't have. Sarah's hands were pressed flat against the cold, rusted metal of the box, the rough texture digging into her palms. It was no longer a symbol of hope. It was a lodestone, a cursed weight dragging her and her son into an abyss. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, her lungs refusing to take in the thick, damp air. A wave of violent trembling racked her body, a delayed reaction of pure terror that she couldn't control. He would be back. Not with paperwork, not with cash. He would be back for this box, and he would not let a woman and a child stand in his way. The image of his cold, predatory eyes was burned into her mind, a promise of ruthless violence. He had seen their vulnerability, their isolation, and he would exploit it without a shred of mercy. Her mind became a chaotic whirlwind of impossible choices. The treasure in the box was enough to vanish, to start a new life so far away that Arthur Vance could never find them. A clean, safe house. A good school for Luke. Food on the table every single night. The dream she had allowed herself on the bus was suddenly within her grasp, a tangible reality locked in this metal container. But the price was silence. The price was burying the truth of the stolen land and the murdered men even deeper than it already was. It meant becoming a secret keeper, just like Eleanor Blackwood, haunted by the blood that stained the gold. And what if he found them anyway? A man with his resources, his influence. A name change and a cross-country move might not be enough. The alternative was even more terrifying, to use the documents, to fight him, to declare war. The image of Luke's sleeping face, so innocent and trusting, flashed in her mind. To fight Vance would be to paint a target directly on her son's back. It was an unwinnable, suicidal choice, a surge of pure, maternal terror, sharp and powerful, cut through her paralysis. She couldn't stay here. The barn, which had felt like a tomb, now felt like a baited trap. Waiting for Vance to return was not an option. It was suicide. She had to move. She had to find help. But where? The utter isolation of the place, which Vance had so cruelly pointed out, was now a crushing reality. Her mind frantically sifted through the last few days, searching for any scrap of information. The bus driver, his gruff voice, the indifferent wave of his hand. What had he said? Something about a neighbor. Old Man Miller's place is a few miles down that road. only other soul for 10 miles. The memory, insignificant at the time, now felt like a divine message. A single flickering candle in the suffocating darkness. A few miles. A name. Miller. It wasn't a plan, it was a prayer. But it was more than she had a minute ago. It was a direction. It was the only direction. Her heart seized on the name. Miller. The decision made, adrenaline coursed through her veins, a potent cocktail of fear and resolve. She gently shook Luke awake. His eyes opened, wide and disoriented in the gloom. "Mom, what is it?" he whispered, his voice thick with sleep. She put a finger to her lips. "We have to go. Right now. We have to be very quiet." The confusion in his face morphed into fear as he saw the raw terror in her eyes. He didn't ask any more questions. He just nodded, his small face suddenly serious. Sarah grabbed the metal box. It was shockingly heavy, an anchor of secrets and gold. Carrying it would slow her down, but leaving it was unthinkable. It was the cause of this nightmare, but it was also her only leverage, her only proof. With Luke's small, cold hand clutched tightly in hers, and the heavy box bumping against her leg, she slipped out of the gaping entrance of the barn and into the deep, oppressive darkness of the Pennsylvania woods, leaving their meager shelter behind for the terrifying uncertainty of the night. The moon was a pale, useless sliver hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, providing no light to guide their way. The darkness was absolute, a black, velvety void that swallowed sound and sight. Sarah stumbled forward, one hand outstretched, feeling for trees, the other gripping Luke's hand so tightly her knuckles ached. The dirt road was a treacherous landscape of unseen ruts and rocks. Every few steps, her foot would twist, sending a jolt of pain up her ankle. The cold, damp air burned in her lungs. The sounds of the forest at night, once just a backdrop, were now amplified and menacing. Every rustle in the undergrowth sounded like footsteps. Every snap of a twig made her heart leap into her throat. She imagined Vance's thugs behind every tree, his cold eyes watching from the shadows. The weight of the metal box was excruciating, its handle digging a raw groove into her fingers, its corners banging rhythmically and painfully against her thigh. It was a dead weight of terror she was forced to carry. Sheer willpower kept her moving. She whispered words of encouragement to Luke, though they were as much for herself as for him. "We're almost there, sweetie. Just a little farther." Luke, impossibly brave, stumbled along beside her, his breathing coming in small, frightened pants. He didn't cry or complain. His silent fortitude was a source of both immense pride and crushing guilt for Sarah. This was no adventure. This was a child fleeing for his life in the dead of night because of a secret she had unearthed. A profound exhaustion began to set in. A deep, bone-weary fatigue that made her legs feel like lead. Her muscles screamed in protest. The box seemed to get heavier with every step. Doubt began to creep in, a cold, insidious poison. What if she was going the wrong way? What if the bus driver was mistaken? What if this old man Miller was just a myth, or worse, another enemy? The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her, so strong it almost buckled her knees. Just as the last of her hope began to drain away, a new scent cut through the damp, earthy smell of the woods. Wood smoke, faint, but unmistakable. It was the smell of civilization, of a hearth, of a home. A surge of renewed energy shot through her. She quickened her pace, pulling a weary Luke along, her eyes straining in the darkness. Then she saw it. Through a break in the trees, a tiny, flickering point of yellow light, a lamp in a window. It was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen, a beacon of hope in a world of darkness. It was real. The cabin was real. As they drew closer, she could see the structure. It was a small, simple log cabin, dwarfed by the towering trees around it, but it looked solid, sturdy. A thin curl of grey smoke rose from a stone chimney, disappearing into the black sky. Unlike the decaying barn, this place felt cared for, lived in. It felt safe. Her breath caught in a sob of pure, unadulterated relief. They had made it. They stumbled out of the woods and into the small, neat clearing in front of the cabin. A stack of perfectly cut firewood was piled against one wall. A small, well-tended garden sat to the side. There was an order here, a peace that stood in stark, jarring contrast to the chaos of her life. But as she stood before the simple wooden door, a new fear took hold, the fear of the unknown. Who was this man? This old man Miller? What would he do when a terrified woman and her child appeared on his doorstep in the middle of the night, carrying a box of secrets? She had led them here on a blind prayer, but now, faced with the reality of knocking on this door, her courage wavered. What if he turned them away? Or worse, what if he was somehow connected to Vance, to the Blackwood family, another piece of this cursed puzzle? Her hand hovered over the wood of the door, trembling. She was out of options. She had to trust. It was her only remaining move in this terrifying game. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she knocked. The sound was a loud, intrusive violation of the night's peace. For a long moment, there was no response. The silence pressed in again, and Sarah's heart sank. Maybe no one was home. Maybe the lamp was just left on. She was about to knock again, a frantic, desperate pounding this time, when she heard a sound from within, a slow, heavy scraping, like a chair being pushed back from a table. Then the sound of a bolt being drawn, a loud metallic clack. A sliver of warm, yellow light appeared as the door creaked open a few inches. A man's face peered out, half hidden in the shadows. He was old, his face a roadmap of deep wrinkles, framed by a shock of unruly white hair, but his eyes, even in the dim light, were sharp, intelligent and piercing. They took in the scene in an instant, Sarah's terrified expression, her torn clothes, the sleeping child clutching her leg, and the heavy, rusted metal box at her feet. The man's eyes, a surprisingly clear and piercing blue, narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with a deep, weary understanding. He seemed to see not just a desperate woman, but the story that had brought her here. Without a word, he pulled the door wide open. "Get inside," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble like stones grinding together. It was a voice accustomed to long silences. "Both of you." Now, the warmth from the cabin washed over them, a comforting wave that smelled of burning pine, strong coffee, and old books. It was the smell of safety. Sarah practically collapsed over the threshold, her legs finally giving out. She half-dragged, half-carried Luke inside as the old man shut and bolted the door behind them, plunging the small room into a secure, comforting stillness. The single oil lamp on a rough-hewn wooden table cast a warm, flickering glow over the room, revealing walls lined with bookshelves, a simple cot and a small stone fireplace where a low fire crackled merrily. The old man gestured to a worn armchair near the fire. "Sit," he commanded gently. Sarah sank into it, the sudden relief so overwhelming she felt dizzy. Luke, now fully awake, stared at the man with wide, curious eyes. The man ignored them both for a moment, moving with a slow, deliberate economy of motion. He stoked the fire, sending a cascade of bright orange sparks up the chimney, then poured a steaming liquid from a blackened kettle into a thick ceramic mug. He handed it to Sarah. It was coffee, black and scalding hot. The intense heat of the mug seeped into her cold, numb fingers, and the bitter, earthy aroma was a jolt to her senses. "Drink," he said, "then you'll talk." He pulled up a stool and sat opposite her, his piercing blue eyes fixed on her face, waiting. The silence was not awkward, it was patient, a space for her to gather the shattered pieces of her story. Her heart was still pounding, but the frantic, panicked edge had subsided, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. Sarah drank the coffee, the hot liquid a burning trail to her cold, empty stomach. The warmth spread through her chest, steadying her trembling hands. She finally found her voice, and the story came tumbling out, a frantic, disjointed torrent of words. She told him about the eviction, the lawyer, the false hope of the barn. She described the hollow floorboard, the hidden cellar, and the metal box. Her voice cracked as she spoke of the gold, the diamonds, and the journal. And then she told him about Arthur Vance. She described his cold eyes, his condescending voice, and his veiled threat against her son. As she spoke, the old man, Joe Miller, listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, his gaze never wavering. He was a statue carved from granite and patience, absorbing every detail, every nuance of her terror. He just listened, his silence a strange source of comfort, allowing her to purge the fear that had been choking her. A single tear, hot and heavy, finally escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. When she finally fell silent, exhausted and emotionally drained, Joe Miller leaned forward slightly, his weathered hands resting on his knees. "This box," he said, his gravelly voice low and serious. "The journal, the documents, you have them with you?" Sarah nodded numbly, gesturing to the rusted metal container on the floor beside her chair. It seemed to squat there like a malevolent toad, the source of all her trouble. Joe stared at the box for a long moment, a strange mix of emotions flickering in his eyes, recognition, sorrow, and something else, something that looked like a very old and very cold anger. The air in the small cabin grew thick and heavy, charged with the weight of unspoken history. He seemed to be looking not at a box, but through a doorway into the distant past-y, a past filled with ghosts and grievances. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the room, a lonely counterpoint to the profound, heavy silence that had fallen between them. He finally looked back at Sarah, his gaze sharp as a shard of glass. "Show me," he said. The words were not a request, but a command. Sarah hesitated for only a second. She knelt on the floor, her hands trembling as she worked the stiff, rusted latch on the metal box. The loud, grating screech of the metal sounded obscene in the quiet cabin. She lifted the heavy lid. The soft lamplight seemed to fall into the box and die, absorbed by the dark velvet pouches and the yellowed paper. She bypassed the gold and the diamonds, the source of her immediate terror, and reached for the thing that felt like the heart of the matter. She lifted out the leather-bound journal, its worn cover feeling both ancient and strangely alive in her hands. Her fingers fumbled as she opened it to the page she had read earlier, the page where Eleanor Blackwood had listed the names of the miners who had disappeared. She held the book out to Joe, her own finger, thin and trembling, pointing to the list of faded names written in elegant, spidery script. She watched his face, her breath held tight in her chest. Joe Miller took the journal from her, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle with the fragile old book. He didn't need to read the whole list. His eyes, sharp and clear despite his age, went immediately to the third name down. He stared at it, and Sarah saw a profound and terrible transformation come over his face. The calm, patient observer vanished, replaced by a man staring into an open grave. His jaw tightened, and a muscle began to twitch in his cheek. The deep lines around his eyes seemed to deepen, etched by a sudden, overwhelming wave of grief that was half a century old but as raw as an open wound. He slowly raised a gnarled, trembling finger and traced the name on the page, his touch as soft as a whisper. "Daniel Miller," he read aloud, his voice no longer a gravelly rumble, but a choked, ragged whisper thick with an ancient sorrow. He looked up at Sarah, and in his eyes she saw the missing piece of the puzzle, the personal, human cost of the Blackwood fortune. "He was my father," Joe said, the words falling like stones into the silent room. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs, a sudden, sharp gasp. The connection was immediate, undeniable, and horrifying. This wasn't just history to him. This was family. This was blood. A wave of dizziness washed over her as the full weight of the story crashed down. She wasn't just a stranger who had stumbled upon a secret. She was a messenger, an unwitting agent of fate who had carried this terrible truth back to the one person in the world to whom it mattered most. The name on the page was no longer just a name. It was this man's father, a man with a face, a voice, a life, a son who had grown into an old man waiting. Joe closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, the sorrow was gone, replaced by a hard, cold fury that seemed to emanate from him in waves. He was no longer just a kind old man. He was the last living witness. Joe Miller began to speak, and the story he told was not the sanitized, guilt-ridden version from Eleanor's journal, but the brutal, first-hand account of a survivor. His voice was low and steady, but infused with a righteous anger that had simmered for over 50 years. He spoke of his father, Daniel, not as a victim, but as a leader, a proud, strong man with calloused hands and a powerful voice who had dared to stand up to the coal baron, demanding fair wages and safe conditions for his friends and neighbors. He described the community, a tight-knit world of poor farmers and miners bound together by shared hardship and a fierce sense of justice. He painted a vivid picture of the hope that had flickered among them when they decided to unionize, the dangerous belief that they could win, that their lives mattered. He spoke with a clarity and detail that was chilling, as if the events had happened yesterday, the memories preserved perfectly in the amber of his grief. He described the fear that had slowly poisoned their community as the Baron's threats grew more explicit. He remembered the hushed conversations, the men looking over their shoulders, the wives who begged their husbands to give up the fight. Then he described the disappearances. It started with one man, a vocal organizer. His wife said he'd gone to Pittsburgh to look for work. Then another, then a third. Plausible stories were concocted for each, but a cold, unspoken terror gripped the community. They knew, everyone knew what was happening, but they were powerless to stop it. They were poor, uneducated miners against a wealthy, powerful man who owned the police, the judges, and the politicians. There was no one to turn to. He spoke of the night his own father failed to come home from the mine, the hollow sickness in his stomach, his mother's silent, ceaseless weeping. The official story was a mining accident, a cave-in. His body was never recovered. The mine was sealed. The land was then legally acquired by the Blackwood estate for pennies on the dollar. Joe picked up one of the forged deeds Sarah had taken from the box. He didn't need to examine the signature. He just looked at the plot of land it described. "This was our farm," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "My father worked this land. My grandfather worked this land. We were losing it. The mine was supposed to save it. Instead, the Baron used the mine to steal it." He tapped the brittle paper with his finger. "This piece of paper is the lie that buried my father. I am the last one left who knows the truth. All the others, they died or moved away." Taking the silence with them, I stayed. I don't know why. Maybe I was waiting for a sign, waiting for someone to come along who had the one thing we never had. He looked from the deed to the metal box. Proof. The final missing piece of the puzzle clicked into place in Sarah's mind with terrifying clarity. This wasn't just about justice for the dead. It was about redemption for the living. A new and terrible understanding dawned on Sarah. Arthur Vance wasn't just trying to recover a lost family fortune. He was trying to bury a family crime. The gold and diamonds were not just money. They were evidence. The journal, the deeds, the whole story. As long as it remained hidden, he was just a wealthy lawyer. But if this box was ever opened, if this story ever came to light, he would become the heir to a legacy of theft and murder. His name, his reputation, his entire world would be destroyed. This explained his speed, his ruthlessness, his immediate escalation to threats. He wasn't just greedy, he was desperate. He was a man protecting a dark and bloody secret that underpinned his entire existence. The cold dread in Sarah's stomach intensified. She had thought he was a wolf hunting for gold. She now realized he was a monster trying to keep a graveyard sealed, and she was standing at the gate with the key in her hand. There was no negotiating with a man like that. There was only survival. Joe Miller seemed to read her thoughts. His face hardened, the weary sorrow replaced by the sharp, tactical focus of a survivor. "He gave you 24 hours, Joe said, his voice a low growl. "He lied." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her throat suddenly dry. "A man like Vance, a man with that much to lose, doesn't give you time to think," Joe explained, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "He doesn't give you time to run. He doesn't give you time to find help." He gestured around the small, isolated cabin. "He gave you the ultimatum to make you feel like you had a choice, to keep you in one place. He won't send a lawyer with paperwork tomorrow. He'll send thugs, and he'll send them tonight. His goal isn't just to get the box. It's to erase the problem, to erase the evidence." He paused, and his next words landed like a physical blow. "And to erase the witnesses, all of them." The unspoken threat hung in the air. Her, Luke, and now him. A primal, suffocating panic seized Sarah. The cabin, which had felt like a sanctuary, now felt like another trap. Her mind flashed with the image of Vance's cold, merciless eyes. Joe was right. The threat against Luke had not been a negotiating tactic. It had been a statement of intent. They were loose ends, liabilities to be eliminated. "What do we do?" she breathed, the words barely audible. Her gaze darted to Luke, who had finally fallen asleep in the armchair, his small face peaceful and oblivious to the mortal danger they were in. A fierce, protective instinct, more powerful than any fear, rose up in her. She would not let that man harm her son. She would burn the world to the ground first. Joe stood up, his movement suddenly filled with a grim, urgent purpose. "He thinks you're still at the barn. He thinks you're a frightened, helpless woman waiting to be dealt with. That's our only advantage. He's underestimating you. We have to move. Now, before they get there." Joe moved to a dark corner of the cabin and pulled back a heavy, moth-eaten rug, revealing a trapdoor identical to the one in the barn. A cold shiver went down Sarah's spine. It seemed this whole cursed land was built on top of secrets. "Now this leads out to the creek bed, a quarter-mile back," Joe explained, his voice low and urgent as he lifted the heavy door. "It's an old escape route from the mining days. He won't know about it. He'll be focused on the road, on the front of the property." He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a grim determination. "Grab the box. We'll take the back trail to the ridge. From there, we can see the barn. We need to know for sure what he's doing." The thought of going back, even to a vantage point, filled her with terror. But he was right. They had to know. She scooped up the sleeping Luke in one arm, his warm, limp body a precious weight against her chest. With her other hand, she grabbed the handle of the cold, heavy metal box. It was time to run again. They descended into the narrow, dark tunnel. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and roots. It was a tight squeeze, and Sarah's shoulder scraped against the rough dirt walls as she maneuvered with Luke in her arms and the heavy box banging against her knees. Joe led the way with a small, sputtering oil lantern that cast huge, dancing shadows on the walls, making the tunnel feel alive and menacing. The path was uneven and sloped downward, and several times Sarah slipped in the mud, her heart lurching with the fear of falling and dropping her son. The only sounds were their own ragged breathing and the soft, rhythmic thud of the box against her leg. It felt like they were being swallowed by the earth, burrowing like terrified animals away from the predators on the surface. Her muscles burned, her lungs ached, but she pushed onward, driven by the single, overriding imperative to get her son to safety. The tunnel seemed to stretch on for an eternity, a dark, suffocating birth canal into a new and even more uncertain world. Finally, she saw a faint grey light ahead. They emerged, gasping, into the cool night air from a tangle of thorny bushes near a shallow, fast-moving creek. The sound of the rushing water was a relief, washing away the claustrophobic silence of the tunnel. Joe immediately extinguished the lantern, plunging them back into the deep shadows of the woods. "This way," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the gurgling water. "Stay low and stay quiet." He led them away from the creek and up a steep, pine-covered incline. The ground was slippery with a thick carpet of pine needles, and the climb was brutal. Sarah's lungs were on fire, and her arm felt like it was being torn from its socket from the combined weight of her son and the cursed box. But she didn't slow down, matching Joe's determined, ground-eating pace. He moved through the darkness, with the sure-footed confidence of a man who had walked these woods his entire life. He was a part of this land, a ghost of its violent past, now leading them toward a final confrontation. They reached the top of the ridge and crouched behind a thick outcrop of rock. Below them, through a gap in the trees, they could see the clearing. They could see the barn. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. The clearing was not empty. A large, battered pickup truck, its paint peeling and one headlight broken, was parked where Vance's luxury car had been. Its engine was off, but its presence was a throbbing, malevolent thing in the quiet night. As they watched, two figures got out. They were big men dressed in dark, functional work clothes. They moved with a brutish, predatory confidence, their shoulders hunched. They weren't there to talk. One of them was carrying a crowbar. The other was holding two large, red plastic cans. Gasoline. Joe's prediction had been terrifyingly accurate. A wave of nausea so strong it almost made her gag washed over Sarah. If they had stayed in the barn, if she had waited, Luke would be... She couldn't complete the thought. She pulled her sleeping son closer, burying her face in his soft hair. The two men didn't waste any time. They moved toward the barn with a grim purposefulness. The man with the crowbar used it to smash what was left of a window, the sound of shattering glass echoing unnaturally loud in the night. Sarah flinched, a sharp, involuntary jerk. Then they disappeared inside the dark, gaping maw of the barn. For a minute, there was silence. Sarah held her breath, her ears straining. Then she heard it. A faint, rhythmic splashing sound, the sound of liquid being sloshed onto dry wood, onto old hay. They were dousing the entire structure. They were preparing a funeral pyre. Her heart pounded in her ears, a frantic, panicked beat that seemed loud enough for the men below to hear. This was the reality of Arthur Vance's generous offer. It wasn't a negotiation, it was an execution. They weren't just destroying evidence. They were salting the earth, erasing every trace that she and her son had ever existed. It was an act of absolute, psychopathic ruthlessness. One of the men emerged from the barn. He stood back, a silhouette against the dark structure, and Sarah could see him flick something with his thumb. A lighter. A tiny, bright orange flame flickered to life, a stark point of light in the overwhelming darkness. It looked so small, so insignificant, yet it held the power to unleash hell. The man tossed the lighter into the barn. For a single, breathless second, nothing happened. Then the night exploded. It wasn't a gradual fire, it was a detonation, a deep whoosh of sound, a violent, hungry roar as the gasoline vapors ignited in a massive fireball. A wave of heat washed over the ridge, and Sarah instinctively shielded Luke's face. The entire barn was instantly engulfed in a writhing, roaring column of orange and yellow flame. The gaping holes in the roof became vents for the inferno, spewing black, oily smoke and a shower of glowing red embers into the night sky, painting the clouds in a hellish, flickering light. The two thugs stood and watched for a moment, their faces illuminated by the inferno they had created, their expressions blank and impassive. They had done their job. They got back in their truck, the engine roaring to life, and sped away without a backward glance, leaving the fire to complete its work. Sarah, Joe, and Luke remained on the ridge, hidden in the shadows, watching the barn burn. The structure that had been the scene of her deepest despair and her most miraculous discovery was being consumed, its secrets turned to ash and smoke. The heat was intense, even from this distance, and the roar of the flames was a deafening, constant, hungry sound. It was a monument of fire, a testament to Arthur Vance's depravity. But he had failed. As Sarah clutched the heavy metal box to her chest, she knew he had failed. He had destroyed the building. But he hadn't destroyed the truth. He thought he was erasing the witnesses. He had no idea he had just created them. The inferno roared below them, a monstrous living beast devouring the barn, its hungry flames licking the night sky. The heat was a physical blow, hot and dry on Sarah's face, and the air was thick with the acrid, choking smell of burning wood, hay, and a century of dust. Ash, like black snow, drifted down around them, settling on their hair and clothes. Beside her, Joe Miller held a battered old cell phone to his ear, his knuckles white. His voice was a low, urgent whisper, a thread of calm slicing through the chaotic roar of the fire. "Clara, it's me. You need to listen carefully. It's happening. The Blackwood secret. It's real." He paused, listening. Sarah clutched the heavy metal box, its coldness a stark contrast to the fire's heat. This object, which had been a curse, now felt like a shield, a weapon. Joe continued, "No, I'm safe, but there's a woman here, and her boy. They found it all, the journal, the deeds, and Vance knows. He just tried to kill them." The gravity of the words settled in the fiery air. The final desperate gamble had been made. The trip to Philadelphia was a surreal blur, a jarring transition from the primeval darkness of the woods to the harsh, structured reality of the city. The roar of the fire was replaced by the roar of traffic, the smell of wood smoke by the acrid tang of exhaust fumes. Clara Miller's office was on a high floor of a glass and steel skyscraper, a world away from the dirt and decay Sarah had known. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of expensive paper and clean electricity. Clara was a younger, sharper version of her grandfather. Her eyes held the same piercing intelligence, but her power was different. It was the power of law and logic, contained within a perfectly tailored grey suit. Sarah felt grimy and out of place as she stood on the plush carpet, Luke clinging silently to her hand. With trembling arms, she placed the rusted metal box on the vast, polished mahogany desk. The dull thud it made seemed to echo in the silent, sterile room. It was an artifact from a different, bloodier world, and its presence felt like a desecration of this clean space. It was a transfer of a burden. Clara Miller didn't speak. She simply circled the desk and knelt, her movements precise as she opened the rusted latch. For a moment, she just looked inside, her professional composure unshaken by the dull gleam of gold or the greasy shimmer of the raw diamonds. Her interest lay deeper. With the careful touch of an archivist, she lifted out the stack of yellow documents first, her sharp eyes scanning the forged deeds, a flicker of recognition in them. Then she took the journal. Sarah watched, her heart pounding, as Clara turned the fragile pages, her perfectly manicured finger tracing the frantic, spidery script. She read in silence, her expression slowly hardening. The professional curiosity melted away, replaced by a cold, controlled fury that was terrifying in its stillness. It was her grandfather's anger, refined and weaponized. The faint, musty smell of the old paper filled the air-conditioned office. When Clara finally looked up, her eyes met Sarah's, and in them, Sarah saw not pity, but a promise of retribution. "He won't get away with this," she said, her voice quiet but as hard as steel. Clara moved to her phone with an electrifying sense of purpose. The power in the room shifted entirely. It was no longer about the terror of Vance, but the cold, calculating machinery of justice being brought to bear. Her voice was calm, measured, and utterly devoid of emotion as she spoke to someone at the Department of Justice. "I have a whistleblower, a primary witness in a case of historical land fraud, conspiracy, extortion, and attempted murder linked to the Blackwood estate." Each legal term was a hammer blow, dismantling Vance's world piece by piece. Sarah listened, mesmerized, clutching Luke's hand. The fear that had been a constant, gnawing presence in her gut for days began to recede, replaced by a sense of awe. The evidence is physical, extensive, and corroborated by the suspect's recent actions, including arson with intent to harm. "My witness and her minor child are in my custody and require immediate protection. Yes, I'll hold." The quiet click of the hold button was the loudest sound Sarah had ever heard. It was the sound of a giant awakening, of a system she never knew existed, turning its implacable gaze toward Arthur Vance. The federal response was not a slow-moving wave, it was a lightning strike. Within hours, Sarah and Luke were in a secure government facility, the air smelling of clean linens and bland, institutional food. It was the safest she had felt in years. The real action was happening miles away, a storm breaking over Arthur Vance's perfectly ordered life. News footage, relayed to them on a small television, showed a swarm of dark-suited agents descending on Vance's prestigious Philadelphia law firm. There was no politeness, no deference to his status. They moved with swift, brutal efficiency, armed with a federal warrant. Employees were herded out, their faces masks of shock and confusion. Boxes of files were carried out. The scene was one of controlled chaos, the public dismantling of a powerful man's empire. From the street, a news helicopter captured the moment Arthur Vance was escorted from the building. The arrogant confidence that had so terrified Sarah was gone, replaced by a look of stunned, sputtering disbelief. His world was ending in broad daylight, for all to see. The moment of his arrest was replayed endlessly, flanked by two grim-faced agents. Arthur Vance was a picture of impotent fury. The expensive fabric of his suit jacket was bunched up where a hand gripped his arm, and the coldly unforgiving steel of handcuffs glinted at his wrists. He shouted at the cameras, his voice, once so smooth and menacing, now a shrill, undignified screech of denials and threats. "You have no idea who I am," he yelled, a desperate, pathetic cry. But no one was listening. He was no longer Arthur Vance, the influential attorney. He was a suspect, a common criminal, caught in the unflinching glare of justice. Sarah watched the television, her hand covering her mouth. The man who had threatened her child, who had burned her last hope to the ground, was now just a frightened man in a crumbling world. The knot of terror that had been lodged in her chest for so long, a physical, painful thing, finally began to dissolve. It wasn't a feeling of victory or revenge. It was simpler and more profound. It was the feeling of relief, a deep, shuddering exhalation she had been holding in for a lifetime. The legal process was methodical and absolute. With the evidence from the box and the testimony of both Sarah and Joe, the case was airtight. The historical crimes of the Blackwood family were laid bare, a dark chapter of local history finally brought into the light. In a quiet, powerful moment in a courtroom, the forged deeds were nullified, A judge officially restored the title of the Miller family farm to Joe, its last surviving heir. Sarah saw a picture of him days later, standing in a field of tall grass, his hand resting on an old stone wall, his face turned toward the sun. It was the face of a man whose ghosts had finally been laid to rest. The fortune, as the proceeds of crime, was confiscated by the federal government. But Clara explained that the law had provisions. For her role, for the immense risk she had taken, Sarah was legally entitled to a substantial whistleblower award. The number written on the official cashier's check made her dizzy. It wasn't blood money. It wasn't a curse. It was a reward. It was justice. It was a new beginning, printed in crisp black ink. The first thing she bought was a house. It wasn't a mansion, but to Sarah it was a palace. It was a small blue bungalow on a quiet, tree-lined street, with a sturdy front door that had a brand-new, gleaming brass lock. The first time she turned the key, the solid, satisfying click was the most beautiful sound in the world. The house smelled not of mold and decay, but of fresh paint and new carpets. Luke had his own room, the walls painted a bright, cheerful yellow, his laughter echoing down the hallway. A sound Sarah realized she hadn't truly heard in years. The gnawing ache of hunger was a distant, nightmarish memory. Their refrigerator was always full. She found a quiet joy in the simple, mundane act of packing his school lunch each morning, carefully placing an apple next to a sandwich, an act of love no longer tainted by desperation. The perpetual tension in her shoulders began to release, and the deep, exhausted lines on her face started to soften. She could sleep through the night without the fear of footsteps or the sound of a car engine in the distance. She could finally breathe. One evening, months later, Sarah stood in her new kitchen, the air warm and fragrant with the scent of roasting chicken and garlic. The sounds from the living room were of a cartoon on the television and Luke's delighted laughter. On the counter sat a brand-new, gleaming sewing machine, a purchase she'd made just for herself, a promise of creative, quiet work to come. She set the table with new plates, the simple, solid ceramic a world away from the rusted bucket they had used for water. She brought out the platter, the chicken golden brown and perfect, surrounded by roasted potatoes and green beans. Luke ran to the table, his eyes wide with excitement, not the haunted, weary look she remembered from the barn. As they sat down to eat, under the warm glow of the dining room light, Sarah looked at her son, his face healthy and happy, and a profound sense of peace washed over her. The ghost of Eleanor Blackwood was gone. The cold menace of Arthur Vance was a fading memory. She had taken an inheritance of horror and, through an act of impossible courage, transformed it into a future of hope. She hadn't just found a fortune, she had earned her life back. The rusted metal box, once a container of secrets and sin, became a catalyst for redemption. It brought justice to the dead, peace to the living, and a future for a mother and son who had been discarded by the world. Sarah Johnson's story is a testament to the fact that true wealth isn't measured in gold or diamonds, but in the courage it takes to face down darkness and demand the truth. She proved that even the most deeply buried crimes cannot hide from a determined heart, and that the actions of one seemingly powerless person can topple an empire built on lies. Her journey from the cold despair of a city sidewalk to the warm safety of her own home was more than just a change of fortune. It was the reclaiming of a soul. Sarah's story is a powerful reminder that even in the deepest darkness, a single spark of courage can ignite an inferno of justice. If you were moved by her journey from desperation to redemption, subscribe to our channel and press the notification bell so you never miss another story of truth uncovered and justice served.